The storm came down off the mountains like something with a grudge, and it was in the worst of it, on a road that led nowhere anyone wanted to be, that Victoria Montalvo parked her husband's black sedan at the edge of a ravine and did not cry. She had rehearsed crying. She was good at it, when it mattered. But there was no one out here to perform for except the man slumped and unconscious in the back seat, and Rafael Montalvo. 62 years old, silver-haired, a man who had built a fortune out of vineyards and shipping lanes and the particular stubbornness of people who refused to lose, was in no condition to appreciate the show. Diego Serrano dragged him from the car himself, mud soaking through his knees, rain running in sheets down a face that had once charmed Victoria across a dinner table and had, in the years since, learned to do far worse things with the same charm. He was breathing hard by the time he came back for the small leather case that held Rafael's heart medication, his blood thinners, the pills that kept an aging body walking the line between illness and survival. "He's not waking up," Diego said. "The dose Inés got us could have put down a horse." "Good." Victoria checked her reflection in the visor mirror, unbothered. "Did you get his pills?" He held up the case, and for a moment something like conscience passed over his face. "Gone as quickly as it came. Without these, a man his age, out here, in this cold." "Diego." She turned to look at him properly, and there was something almost tender in the way she reached out and touched his jaw, the way you might touch someone you intended to keep. "In 3 days, I bury my husband. In 4, I inherit everything. And you and I start over. Somewhere with sun. Somewhere with no Rafael." They left him at the tree line with nothing. No wallet, no papers, nothing that could tell the world who he had been. Diego burned what little identification there was in a roadside barrel before they drove away, and if Victoria didn't look back even once, Diego allowed himself a single glance in the mirror before the dark swallowed the shape of the man they'd left to die. Some men, Victoria thought, driving back toward a house that would soon be entirely hers, are worth more dead than alive. My husband just doesn't know it yet. Behind her, in the mud, Rafael's hand twitched. 3 days later, and a great many miles from anywhere that mattered to people like Victoria Montalvo, Esperanza Ruiz, Perla, to everyone who loved her, stood in the doorway of a ranch house that had seen better decades and listened to her dogs bark at something in the east field that was not, she was certain, a coyote. The Ruiz Ranch was the kind of place that ran on hope and unpaid debts in roughly equal measure. Tomas, her husband, had spent the morning fixing a fence post that had already been fixed twice that year, and their daughter Camila, 19 and sharp enough to know exactly how bad things had gotten, even if her parents tried to spare her the worst of it, was leading a limping horse toward the barn when Perla's instinct pulled her toward the field instead. "The bank called again," Camila had said that morning. "They want an answer by Friday." "Tell them Friday is a fine day to still be poor," Tomas had answered, not looking up from his work, and there was more resignation in the joke than either of them wanted to admit. But Perla wasn't thinking about the bank when she pushed through the tall grass at the edge of the east field and found a man face down in the mud, barely breathing, his clothes fine and ruined in equal measure, his hands soft in a way that told her immediately he had never done a day's labor in his life. "Tomas!" She screamed. "Tomas, hurry!" He came running, took one look at the stranger, and hesitated in the particular way of a man who has learned, through hard years, exactly how little his family can afford to give away. "Perla, we don't know this man. We can't feed our own family. Nobody found me on a road, Tomas." The words came out of her sudden and fierce, older than the moment itself. "Nobody came. I won't let it happen to someone else. Not while I have hands to carry him." It was the kind of thing she rarely said, and Tomas, who had married her 20 years ago knowing there was a wound in her she never fully explained, understood enough not to ask more of it right then. He nodded, and together they carried the stranger home. The town doctor, Felipe Mora, examined the man by lamplight that night and did not like what he found. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, he told Perla, checking the stranger's pupils, drawing a small vial of blood. No wallet, no papers, and traces of a sedative in his system, something pharmaceutical grade, not the kind of thing you find by accident out here. This wasn't an accident, Perla. Will he live? If the fever breaks by morning. Dr. Mora frowned at the vial in his hand. I'll tell you something stranger, though. I don't recognize this man, and I don't recognize his blood type either, not exactly. Something about it is unusual enough that I want to run it properly in town, when I get the chance. The stranger stirred before he finished speaking, murmuring something incoherent, his eyes fluttering open onto a room and two faces he had never seen before in his life. Where, he managed. Who? You're safe now, Perla said, taking his hand without thinking about it, the way you might comfort a child. You're safe. But the panic that crossed his face a moment later had nothing to do with safety. I don't know who I am. Perla and Tomas exchanged a look over the bed, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, that whoever had done this to him had taken more than his medicine and his name. They had taken his entire past, and left it somewhere on that road with no intention of ever giving it back. Back at the Montalvo estate, grief had never looked so composed. Victoria sat across from Ines Alcazar, Rafael's estate lawyer, sharp-eyed and unfailingly thorough, dressed in elegant black, dabbing at eyes that had not, in fact, produced a single genuine tear. The search parties found his car abandoned near the ravine, Senora Montalvo, Ines said, laying out documents with the careful neutrality of someone whose job required her not to have opinions about her clients' marriages. Given the storm, given his heart condition and the missing medication, the authorities believe he wandered off, disoriented, and didn't survive the night. My Rafael. A single, perfectly timed tear. Always so stubborn about his health. I begged him to take his pills with him everywhere. There's no body yet, Senora. Legally, we may need to wait for a declaration of presumed death before the estate can. Of course, Victoria said, catching the sharpness in her own voice a half-second too late. Whatever the law requires. I only want closure. Ines studied her a moment longer than was comfortable, some old instinct for the shape of a lie beginning to itch at the back of her mind, and gathered her papers to leave. The moment the door shut behind her, Victoria's grief evaporated as though it had never existed at all, and Diego stepped out from the shadow of an adjoining room where he'd been listening. She suspects something, he said. She's a lawyer, not a psychic. Victoria poured herself a drink, steady-handed. Let her suspect. As long as she has no proof, she has nothing. And if they find him alive? Nobody survives 3 nights on that mountain without medicine, without shelter, without a name. She said it the way other people discussed the weather. He's already a dead man, Diego. We just need the paperwork to agree with reality. Captain Andres Osorio had spent 20 years learning that grief and guilt often wore the same clothes, and something about the thin file on his desk, Montalvo, Rafael, missing/presumed deceased, was already beginning to smell wrong to him. The widow's already filed for a presumption of death hearing, his officer told him, setting down a cup of coffee. Fast, for a wife still grieving. Awfully organized for a woman in mourning. Osorio flipped through the report. 2 sets of tire tracks at the ravine. No struggle. The medication case missing entirely, and yet the man's gold cufflinks left untouched in plain sight. Thieves take valuables. They don't take pills and leave gold. He circled a name on the estate paperwork. Ines Alcazar, listed as counsel, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had learned, over the years, that lawyers got nervous faster than wives. Let's have a conversation with the lawyer, he said. 2 weeks passed on the Ruiz ranch, and the stranger, thinner now, sun-browned, dressed in Tomas's old work clothes because his own had been ruined beyond saving, stood at the corral fence one morning watching a wild, unbroken horse buck and snort with a violence that made even Tomas wince. Papa, he's going to get himself killed, Camila said. Let him try, Tomas answered, not without some grim curiosity. Maybe it'll shake something loose in that head of his. What happened next surprised all three of them. The stranger climbed the fence, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted, an old, buried confidence surfacing from a place he couldn't name and didn't recognize as his own. He approached the horse slowly, murmuring low, the words coming without thought. Shoo. Facile, facile. I know you don't trust hands you don't recognize. Neither do I, these days. The horse calmed. Astonishingly, it let him rest a hand on its neck, and Tomas and Camila stood frozen at the fence, watching a man who couldn't remember his own name handle a wild animal like he'd done it 1,000 times. That's not luck, Tomas murmured. That's a horseman's hands. The stranger stared down at his own palms as though they belonged to someone else entirely. I don't understand it. I feel like I've done this before. Like it's the only thing I remember how to do. Perla, drying her hands on her apron as she crossed the yard, watched him with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, from simple gratitude into something she couldn't quite name, a recognition with no evidence behind it, and no explanation she could offer even to herself. Maybe your hands remember what your mind's still hiding from you, she said. Something passed between them in that moment, warm, strange, charged with a connection neither of them understood, and neither of them questioned aloud. That night, over supper, Camila studied her mother's face across the table and asked the question that had been building in her for 2 weeks. You look at him strange, Mama. Like you know him. I don't know him at all, Perla said, too quickly. That's the whole point, isn't it? You never talk about before, Camila pressed gently. Before Papa. Before the ranch. And so, for the first time in years, Perla told her daughter the truth. When I was 6 years old, my mother left me at a bus station and never came back. I waited 3 days before someone finally called the authorities. She paused, an old wound resurfacing in her voice. So when I see someone abandoned on a road with nothing, no name, no one looking for him, I can't walk past that, Camila. I won't ever be able to. Camila said nothing, moved beyond words. Outside, in the dark, the stranger sat alone under a wide field of stars, staring at his own hands, and whispered a name that surfaced from nowhere he could locate. Valentina. He had no idea who she was. Not yet. Ines Alcazar had told herself, more than once, that she was simply doing her job, handling the paperwork of a dead man's estate the way she'd handled 100 estates before. It was easier to believe that in daylight, with documents in front of her, than it was late at night when Diego Serrano let himself into her office with a bottle of wine and a way of looking at her that made her forget, briefly, to be careful. Working yourself to exhaustion for a dead man's paperwork, he said, pouring 2 glasses and sitting closer than was strictly necessary. Someone has to make sure the estate is handled properly, she answered, wary but, despite herself, flattered. You've always been the only honest person in that house, Ines. It's why Raphael trusted you. It's why I trust you. He was manipulating her, and some part of her knew it even as it worked. A hint here about a signature that needed expediting, a suggestion there that the police investigation was nothing but bureaucratic delay, a reminder, always gentle, that helping Victoria meant helping herself too. By the time she was alone again, staring at a forged medical authorization she had drafted with her own hand, she understood exactly what she'd become part of. This isn't right, she thought. But she didn't destroy the document. She only set it aside, and in this world, hesitation was its own kind of guilt. Osorio found her hesitation almost immediately when he brought her in for questioning. You authorized the request for a presumption of death hearing unusually fast, licenciata, he said, leaning back in his chair with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. In my experience, grieving spouses want time. Widows in a hurry make me curious. I only followed the law, Capitan. I'm not accusing you of anything, he said, not unkindly. Yet. But I think you already suspect something's wrong. I've seen that look before, on people who know more than they've said out loud. Ines said nothing. But her silence trembled, and Osorio noticed. The crisis, when it came fast. Camila collapsed in the field one afternoon, doubled over with a pain that turned out to be a burst appendix, and within the hour the Ruiz family was gathered in a hospital hallway listening to Dr. Mora deliver the kind of news that stops a heart. She's lost a lot of blood, and her type is rare, O negative with a rare antigen profile. Our supply is critically low. If we don't find a compatible donor in the next hour. Test me, Perla said, terrified. Test Tomas. Already did, Dar. Mora said grimly. Neither of you match. It was the stranger, who had followed them to the hospital in Tomas's truck, unwilling to be left behind, who stepped forward and said, simply, test me. You don't even know your own name, Dr. Mora said, startled. But, yes. All right. The results came back faster than any of them expected, and Dr. Mora returned to the hallway staring at a chart as though it might rearrange itself into something more believable if he looked at it long enough. It's a match, he said. A perfect match. In fact, this profile is so specific, the odds of an unrelated donor matching this closely are almost impossible. He looked up, and his voice dropped, uncertain of how to say what came next. This isn't just compatibility. This looks like family. Perla went pale, and somewhere beneath the hospital lights, the shape of a truth neither of them had let themselves consider began, finally, to take form. That night, in the recovery ward, Perla sat beside the stranger's bed turning an old, tarnished locket over and over in her hands, a keepsake from her own childhood, the only thing she'd had with her the day her mother left her at the bus station. Dr. Mora says it's not a coincidence, she said quietly. He wants to run more tests. She opened the locket, revealing a faded photograph inside, barely legible after so many years. I was left with nothing but this. No name inside it. No answers. Just a picture too worn to make out anymore. The stranger, weak but alert, took it from her carefully and studied the photograph. A young woman, elegant, clearly from another era, and something flickered behind his eyes, a recognition trying to claw its way up through years of fog. I know this face, he said, overwhelmed. I don't know how, but I know this face. He pressed a hand to his temple, pain and memory arriving together. Valentina. Her name was Valentina. Perla went very still. That was my mother's name. The one who left me. Neither of them said what they were both beginning to understand. The silence between them said it instead, and it said everything. While a father and daughter sat in a hospital room slowly rediscovering each other without either of them daring to say the word out loud, Victoria Montalvo was, several hundred miles away, raising a glass of champagne to a room full of people who believed, entirely, that her husband was dead. The presumption of death hearing had concluded in her favor. A death certificate, a closed casket cremation, per his wishes, and, most importantly, no body to examine, no questions to answer. Closed casket, private cremation, she told Diego, reviewing the paperwork with satisfaction. No body means no questions. And the inheritance? Transfers within the week. She raised her glass. To Raphael. May he rest exactly as inconveniently as he lived. She did not know that Osorio was, at that very moment, parked outside the estate gates with a pair of binoculars, watching the celebration through a window and speaking quietly into his phone. Pull the cremation records, he said. I want to know whose ashes are actually in that urn, because I don't think they're his. Back at the ranch, beneath the wide old oak tree that had shaded 3 generations of Ruiz family suppers, Raphael's memory finally broke loose all at once, the way a dam gives way not gradually but suddenly, all its held back weight arriving in a single overwhelming rush. He saw a mansion. A wedding. A young Victoria's smile, warm once, curdling slowly into something colder over the years. And beneath all of it, older and more painful than anything else, a baby girl he had once held in his arms, and then, in the chaos of a bitter family collapse, had let slip away. "I had a daughter," he told Perla, anguished. "Long ago. Her mother, Valentina, we were young, it was a scandal, my family disapproved. I let them send her away. I let them convince me it was for the best." His voice cracked entirely. "I never looked for her. I told myself I would, and then years passed, and shame became easier than searching." Perla, tears streaming freely now, finally said the word that had been circling both of them for weeks. "Papa." It landed like thunder, and Rafael Montalvo, a man who had built an empire out of never once losing control of a room, broke down completely under the weight of it. Not everyone in the family was ready to forgive so quickly, and Camila, now well enough to be furious on her mother's behalf, made no effort to hide it. 20 years, she said to Rafael, sharp as broken glass, and you never looked for her. She used to ask me why nobody ever came back for her. And I never had an answer. You're right to be angry, Rafael said, not defending himself. I have no excuse that will ever be enough. All I can offer is what's left of my life, to try to be worth finding, now that I finally have. I get to be angry and grateful he's alive, Perla told her daughter gently. Both things are true, Mija. Camila didn't fully forgive him that day. But something in her hardened anger cracked open just slightly, and that crack, small as it was the beginning of everything that came after. Inés Alcazar arrived at the police station 3 days later, shaking but resolute, and set a folder of documents down in front of Captain Osorio with the particular relief of someone finally putting down a weight she'd been carrying alone for too long. I have proof, she said. Signed authorizations, falsified medical records, a paper trail showing the cremated remains were never Rafael Montalvo's. They belonged to an unclaimed man from the city morgue, substituted through bribery at the crematorium. I should have come forward weeks ago. I'm done protecting people who never protected anyone but themselves. It's not too late to do the right thing, Licenciada, Osorio said, taking the files. It's only ever too late once you stop. The party at the Montalvo estate was in full swing. Champagne, music, the particular false laughter of high society celebrating an inheritance rather than a life, when the great doors of the hall swung open and the music stopped dead. Rafael Montalvo stood in the threshold. Cleaned up, dressed simply, but unmistakably, undeniably alive. Victoria's face drained of every drop of color. Rafael, you're, how? Alive, he said, quiet and lethal in his calm. Yes. No thanks to you and Diego, and the sedatives you left in my system, and my medication you made sure I wouldn't have. He let the silence stretch before delivering the rest. I remember everything now, Victoria. Every detail of that road. Every word you said, thinking I couldn't hear you. Osorio stepped in behind him, flanked by officers. Diego bolted for a side exit and found the officers already waiting for him there. Victoria, cornered, dropped every last pretense. You were never going to leave me anything real, Rafael, she spat. A young wife, an old man's fortune, what did you expect me to feel, love? I expected honesty, Rafael said. I got greed instead. The difference nearly cost me my life, and gave me back a daughter I'd spent 20 years too ashamed to look for. He paused, and there was no triumph in his voice, only a kind of hard-won peace. So in the end, Victoria, you didn't destroy me. You gave me back to the only family that ever actually wanted me. They were led away in handcuffs as the party guests scattered into scandalized whispers, and Osorio gave Rafael one nod of quiet, professional respect before following. What followed, in the weeks and months after, was not the neat resolution of a fairy tale but something slower and more honest. Victoria, facing trial, turned on Diego without hesitation, painting herself as a woman manipulated by a scheming lover. A lie that unraveled the moment Inés produced the documents proving whose handwriting had authorized the cremation, 3 full days before Rafael was even officially declared missing. I explain it the same way anyone explains wanting a life they were never going to be allowed to have honestly, Victoria finally admitted on the stand, looking toward Raphael in the gallery. You were never going to leave me anything but your name, Raphael. I decided to take the rest myself. You're wrong, Raphael answered, standing, calm and final. I would have given you everything, if you'd only asked with honesty instead of poison. That's the difference between us. I built a fortune out of patience. You tried to steal one out of impatience. Only one of those lasts. Diego, for his part, discovered too late that Victoria had never intended to protect anyone but herself. A betrayal that mirrored, with a kind of bitter symmetry, the one they had committed together against Raphael on that mountain road. Outside the courthouse, watching them both led away for good, Perla asked her father, the word still new enough to feel like a small miracle every time she used it, how it felt to see justice finally done. Empty, he admitted, honest as ever now. I thought it would feel like winning. He looked at her, at the family gathered around him. A family he had done nothing to earn and everything to be grateful for. But the winning already happened. It happened on a muddy road, when a stranger decided I was worth saving. Life afterward did not transform overnight into something simple. Raphael turned down the board's demands that he return immediately to the city, choosing instead to spend his days finishing fences he built badly and slowly learned to build well, under Camila's increasingly patient instruction. He rebuilt the ranch's infrastructure quietly, without turning it into a different place than the one that had saved his life, and Tomas, still occasionally baffled by the idea of a wealthy man for a father-in-law who couldn't hammer a nail straight, grew to genuinely like him, in the unhurried way men do when they've worked alongside each other through hard seasons. Camila's forgiveness came the same way. Not all at once, not with a single speech, but through months of small, consistent choices that proved to her, slowly, that Raphael meant what he said about not losing any more years than he already had. Ines, having helped secure a conviction against the two people who had once nearly used her decency against her, found herself spending more and more time in Captain Osorio's company. Not because either of them had planned it, but because patience, it turned out, had a way of becoming trust when given enough time. And Perla, going through an old box of her mother's belongings that Raphael had tracked down through decades-old family records, found something that stopped her cold one evening, a second photograph, of a baby she didn't recognize, dated 2 years after her own birth. That's not possible, Raphael said, when she showed him, his voice unsteady. What is it? Valentina left my family's house pregnant with you, he said slowly. But if this photograph is real, if this date is real, she may have had another child. After you. One I never knew existed at all. Perla stared at the photograph for a long time, the old grief and the new hope tangled together in a way she was only beginning to understand, a sister, somewhere out there, who had grown up without either of them ever knowing to look. It was, Perla thought, the strangest kind of inheritance. Not money, not a name, not a fortune built on vineyards and shipping lanes. Just the slow, ongoing discovery that family could still be found, even after everyone had long since stopped looking, that the road which had once taken everything from her had, in the end, only ever been returning what was always meant to come home.